movements are mobilised in response to power. So they'll make a gain, and then power structures will respond and re-establish, but they never bring it all the way back to where it was. So it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and slowly the change happens.
It's so interesting, right? Because you see there's like this evolving sort of spectrum where there are people pushing really hard, but then it just creeps along slowly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the nature of the grassroots politics.
Frustrating.
Yeah. Long-term views required. But yeah, you're right, it's frustrating. If you're expecting quick gains, that's what makes this environmental stuff intriguing, because there's this ticking clock and we need to do something about environmental degradation quickly. And yet, in grassroots politics, like, it doesn't work like that.
Even in one of the articles it talks about green consumerism.
Mm.
I mean, people try and go organic or green at their own level, but then it's just limited to that extent.
Yeah.
They are not able to think as a more objective for the entire ecosystem.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, it's not that green consumerism is bad.
Yeah, but it's not definitely enough to...
Yeah, exactly right. If that's all you're doing, then it's not nearly enough.
I was wondering as well how permaculture aids in social sphere to save climate change. I was going through this thing, but I couldn't understand what exactly it is.
Permaculture. It's a shortened version of permanent agriculture or permanent culture, and it's a holistic design system. So the idea is that you design agricultural systems or social systems or economic systems in a way that mimics ecosystems, so that they essentially run themselves. They don't need as many resource or inputs or labour inputs or anything like that, so that they're essentially self-regulating, and that they're integrated with ecosystems as well. So it's using an applied complex systems thinking, using principles from ecology to structure how we do things.
Again, intersection of views.
Yeah, and how you do that, how you design any system, depends on where you are.
That's a huge part, because I'm from culture plays a very important role.
Yeah, so how you would design a permaculture system there, very different to how you do it in Melbourne, yeah.
So it's all about like living in the environment, or with the environment that you like living as opposed to working against it.
Yeah, swimming with the stream rather than against it. And thinking of yourself as a human and our human communities as constituent parts of an ecosystem rather than something that's separate. Community here, environment here, which is how this view of how humans relate to the natural world, that informs how we structure up all of this other stuff. So if we change that view, we consider ourselves as constituent parts of ecosystems, then that can inform the sustainability transition changes that we need to make. And it doesn't necessarily, it's not prescriptive that you must do this. It's you do what's right in your particular location based on these principles.
Can I add an example?
Yeah.
So say you have work and you use a lot of cardboard to sort of cart in all the produce you need for a cafe or whatever. You take that cardboard perhaps and then you take it home to your individual garden and then you lay it down and then you put mulch on top. And so it's sort of taking almost cutting out that middle person to get what you need at your home or your garden or whatever, rather than like buying it new. So there's that sort of, cuts out that little bit extra work.
Yeah. Getting what you need from the local area, reducing your waste systems, or converting what is a waste into a resource for something else, so that you've got a circular system rather than a linear system with extraction and waste at either end. These circular systems, that's what holistic design's all about. So that you're not drawing as much or putting as much waste into the earth. But check it out. If you want information about any of this stuff, I've got lots of things that I can share with you, so just flick me an email.
I was just going to ask you, I don't know, do you know Arnie Mace?
Yeah. Deep ecology guy. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of this is very much comes back to his sort of principles and ideas.
Yeah, and deep ecology is one of these discourses, one of these views of interpreting the environment. So maybe, we're about ready to get rolling again, so let's go there. So let's deconstruct environment movements, look at some of their features. So these are the facilitating conditions of social movements that I referred to at the start. Cross and Snow have got a really good primer article, the link of which is listed here. This is available as an ebook through the library website, so it's easy to find. But if you look at every social movement, there's mobilizing grievances, there's contextual conditions, there's different elements of movement participation, there's different movement dynamics, so how the movements actually work, both internally and externally, and then there's the political impacts and consequences of that movement's activities. So the question is, what do they mean? And that's what we're going to flesh out right now. So let's look at the mobilising grievances first. Now, there could be a number of different mobilising grievances. I'm going to pinpoint a couple, but if you've got any more that you think are pertinent, then yell out and we'll add them to the conversation. So mobilising grievances are the things, the contextual conditions that are happening that are driving people who want to take political action on an issue. So in the case of the environmental movement, it's likely to be things that are having a direct negative impact on people's lives, that are prompting them to want to do something about it. And often, and traditionally, this has been people's direct experience of ecological degradation in their everyday lives. So, pictures tell 1,000 words. What's the 1,000 words that you see up here?
Pollution.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. And what do you think it's like to live in a town next to one of these big mining pits? Yeah, I think this one's in Western Australia. What do you think happens when there's a strong wind? Yeah, so you got dust. What do you think happens every time they blow up one of these faces?
Tremors.
Yeah, there could be some tremors, there could be noise pollution. What do you think it's like to have big trucks carting stuff around through or around the town, or loaded up onto trains? Yeah. So, I mean, this is, of the ones we're looking at here, this is probably a lower impact one. What happens to this site when they're finished with it? Yeah, so this is a big issue, and something that's increasingly talked about in Australia as part of the social licence for mining companies, if they want to develop a mine, is what are they going to do with the site when they're finished mining it? How are they going to rehabilitate and bioremediate that site to leave it in a better condition than this? What kind of life would this site support once it's finished? No, not much at all. I mean, eventually it will. The Earth ecosystems will regenerate, but that's quite a scar to leave on the landscape. What about the air pollution here? If you're living next door to that?
respiratory diseases.
Yeah. What else could be in those emissions?
Like sulfur, omega-3 acidic.
Yeah, so which could contribute to acid rain, which then falls on forests and defoliates forests. Could be toxic carcinogens, cancer-causing molecules in that air, which contributes to cancer clusters in the immediate surrounds. Probably likely to be toxic water runoff from these factories. So it's no accident that a lot of industrial facilities, particularly older ones, are located next to rivers and streams so that they can dump effluent into those waterways. What about this one here? What are the issues with living next to that?
Disease?
Yeah, very much so. If you live here, where are you getting your drinking water? If you live here, where are you bathing? If you live here, where are you getting a lot of food? Catching fish and so forth.
Not to mention if those rivers flood as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, triples.
Yeah. Yeah, and also if you live here, your options for being able to move or do something about that are severely constrained by all of the forms of disempowerment that you experience. So it's these kind of things, these direct experiences that are likely to prompt people to want to do something about it. Think back to those images from London and Britain in the 19th century. Living in that prompted people to start to agitate for regulations that would improve the air quality. And that's the kind of thing that can drive social movement participation. As well as the idea that there's limits to the Earth's resource stocks, and that we need to do something to either decrease our usage of core natural resources, to develop new technologies that don't require these resources. So what are you seeing here? What's this graph about?
How much we've consumed so far and the limit of that resource.
Yeah. So this is quite a sobering graphic about how much of these key resources we've got left at current rates of consumption. So if you have more people who want to consume at Western levels of lifestyle, then these stocks won't last as long. If you've got people reducing the footprint of their consumption, then you've got a bit more time for these resources. But it's very sobering. If you can see approaching limits, then that puts a pressure on to try and find alternatives to those resources or to using less. It also means as these resources become more scarce, the cost of them is going to go up and it's going to have an economic impact. So there can be a business case, an economic imperative for moving away from these resource stocks. Can you think of any technologies that have developed that have changed, have used a different feedstock resource in their production because it's cheaper or because there's an approaching limit? Yeah.
Biofuel in the petroleum industry.
Yep, definitely.
There's also less contemporary alternatives to gold, things that look like gold or
Yeah.
things that they can sell off as gold without actually using gold itself.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's a combo between the limit and the rising costs that makes it economical to use something else. And this is where technological innovations come into play, because those innovations can come in and provide an alternative to the previous technologies that are reliant on stuff that's really scarce. Other mobilising grievances could be the intersection of environmental harms with other forms of disempowerment. So what are we seeing here? What are the intersections?
Intersections of land use,
Yeah, very much so. If we think of, the politics of Indigenous sovereignty, not just here in Australia, but of First Nations peoples around the world, their claims for sovereignty and land rights are directly related to how the land is being used. So if we think, this is an image from Standing Rock at the Sioux Reservation in North Dakota in the United States. So I don't know how familiar you are with this particular struggle. But there was an oil company who wanted to build a transcontinental pipeline over the Missouri River right next to the Sioux Reservation. No, actually, they wanted to build it underneath. There was a significant environmental risk that if this pipeline leaked, it would pollute the Missouri River and impact directly on the Sioux Nation that had their reservation there. And so there was quite a significant political struggle of First Nations people opposing the development of this pipeline. And First Nations people from around the world, not just the United States, came to stand in solidarity here. So it was quite a significant global event. Now, incidentally, recently this pipeline did actually break and leak into the Missouri River, so the fears of the activists actually did come true. But this movement put a lot of pressure on legislators in the United States to do something about this. So President Obama, one of the last acts of his administration, called a halt on development of this pipeline. Donald Trump, when he became president, he put it back on, and it did end up getting built. But that struggle continues now in the courts, even though the actual blockade here was dismantled by the police. What about this one here? There's a gender dimension going on here. So in a lot of societies, there's very strict gender roles on who does what, including in some places in Africa where collection of water and some elements of farming are heavily weighted towards female participation. So environmental harms can directly impact on women in a disproportionate way in these places, impact on their livelihoods, and in so doing impact on their relative power. If you can't make a livelihood, that has a direct impact on your place in a society and your ability to participate and to exercise agency. So that's a big issue. Are there any other intersections not illustrated up here that you can think of that might be pertinent?
Could we think about, not necessarily humans, but animals as a group without a say and people imposing on their rights as well?
Yeah, so if we think of animals as a commodity, what rights have they got? Who speaks for them? If we think about how we treat animals as this industrial commodity and think about, the conditions of how they're traded, how they're slaughtered, etc., if that was done to people, what would that look like? Yeah, and this is a really confronting point to make to people because you're asking people to reconsider the whole food system, a whole lot of cultural practices. So this question can be, deeply confronting. But the industrial food system for animal slaughter looks a lot like the slave trade, looks a lot like concentration camps. So if you think of animals as sentient beings who think and feel like we do and communicate, are able to communicate in ways that are appropriate for their species, then do they have rights to be represented as equal parts of the ecosystems in which we're part of? This is a live debate, in environmental politics. Have this debate with a vegan. It's good fun. Also here, the class dimension. So let's assume a hypothetical situation. What happens if a cyclone goes through this city? These people and these people living right next to each other. How are they going to experience that cyclone? Yep.
The people who are wealthy enough probably have a great opportunity to escape the area temporarily while.
Yeah, great point. So the people in the apartments will probably fly somewhere else for a couple of weeks, ride out the storm. These people, their freedom of movement is probably very limited for financial reasons. So they're stuck there, they have to ride it out. You've got 200 kilometre an hour winds. What's going to happen to this building versus these ones?
They'll just get ripped up.
Yeah. And what about in the aftermath in terms of the clean-up and rebuilding?
People in the apartments might get some funding from the government as well to rebuild.
Yeah. Well, they won't have as much to rebuild to start with.
To mention as well, I think people that live in the slum or the borough there, I'm sure many of them don't even have the right to that land in the first place, and there's houses built along the houses, so they won't even be recognised as having a place they've established.
And it's possible if there's big damage to these places, will the government say, we're going to give that to developers, to fix this land up, to make it better. These people here are going to experience that natural disaster event in a whole different way to their neighbours because of all of the different disempowerments that they experience, because of the nature of the built space that they live in. They're much, much more vulnerable to natural disaster events. And vulnerability is a big issue in terms of environmental shocks. So different people in the same place can experience a disaster event differently according to all of these intersections of disempowerment. Which leads us to the contextual conditions. So let's flesh this out. Contextual conditions is about the why here, why now questions of social movement events. What are the windows of political opportunity that open up to allow a social movement to exert really key influence in a given time? So in the break we talked about the Arab Spring. And why, so the questions here, why did the Arab Spring develop where it did at that particular time in that particular way? Why was that window of political opportunity open there, given that the mobilizing grievances had been there for decades? So why did it explode to life then? So that's the kind of thinking when there's some kind of big environmental protest. What opens the windows of political opportunity to allow those protests to have an impact in a given moment? So let's unpack that. Can you think of any particular environmental protest that has a big impact? What's a case study we can unpack here?
Maybe like Al Gore's work in like the 2000s. He's like run for president.
Yep.
Just like really pushing to mainstream environmental protection.
Yeah. So what was his movie called again?
The Inconvenient Truth.
Yeah, The Inconvenient Truth. That had an enormous impact. So what was going on in 2004, 2006 to make that movie? Well, it's not the first documentary about climate change.
Yeah.
Why did it have such an impact in that moment?
I just remember heavily focusing on like rising sea levels
So a couple of things happened or were going on at that time. Yeah, Angus?
Was it when, well, I know the war in Iraq was quite significant, and maybe a lot of money was being put into that, and so there was this comparison, no money being put into
Yeah, and that became really obvious in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And in the immediate aftermath of that, where ordinarily the National Guard would be deployed for disaster response, where was the National Guard? They're in Iraq. So that really hampered the response to that disaster event. And then, like, if we go back to here, Hurricane Katrina was a great case study of where the people who were most impacted by that disaster event disproportionately were poor, disproportionately were African American, and disproportionately lived in neighbourhoods that were low-lying and vulnerable to flooding. Now, all of those things were related to the power structure in New Orleans. None of those impacts were related to the storm itself. They were all socioeconomic related. So that happened, and there's a big popular response. That feeds into the Al Gore thing. Also, this is in the lead up to the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009, and that had been positioned as the point where the world's going to get it together and have a unified global climate treaty that'll include everyone under one banner. So this is, we had the Paris Agreement in 2015. That was meant to happen in 2009, something like that. Social movement happening in the hallway there. Yes, there was a lot of global expectation related to that, and Al Gore is deliberately trying to influence policymakers and the public in relation to that process. So that's a great example. All right, but just thinking of the idea of the window of political opportunity, that's a really powerful analytical tool for thinking why social movements explode to life in the moments when they do. Another question here is how movement actors are organised and resourced. So there's a lot of different ways that organisations sort of within the umbrella of environmental movements set themselves up. Some of them are involved in lobbying and policy engagement. So these are the organisations that go and engage with governments and go and engage with the corporate sector and trying to have conversations, trying to bring these people into the tent. Then you've got organisations who do protest and disruption. So they're seeing that direct action as a more viable means of exercising some political action than trying to engage. And they say engagement doesn't necessarily work. If we want to have impact, we've got to create a cost for governments and for business for doing the wrong thing in order to get them to change. And then you've got orgs that are instead of doing these things, they're interested in building alternative models. Building the models of what the future might look like so that we've got a demonstration that other people and organisations can work to. And if we come back, Namrata, to your point about permaculture, this is where permaculture fits into this thing. And then on this axis here, for each of these things, there's professional organisations where there's people who are paid, who it's their job to go and do these things, versus participatory organisations where this is volunteer, grassroots activist stuff, people coming together in a less formal way. So can you think of any organisations that might fit into this graphic here? So let's start with the professional lobbying environmental groups. Who comes to mind here? Sorry?
The Greens Party?
Yep, so they'd be in there. Yeah.
Like a trade union movement?
Yeah. I mean, they're not. That's a good one. They're not specifically environmentally focused, but they're one of these allied or related movements that plays a role in the environmental space. So I remember back in 2009, when I was working for the government, I was participated in a program called Union Climate Connectors. So I was a member of the union, and I went and did some lobbying work in Canberra on climate change issues from that perspective. So that's a good call. Yeah, Brad.
Could you also say people who work for think tanks like the Law Institute or something like that that are writing policy or engaging in policy regarding the environment?
Yeah. Any environmental think tanks you can come to mind?
I don't know. I'm sure there are some.
Yeah, Get Up play in that space. World Watch Institute in the US. Worldwide Fund for Nature, they play in this space. The Post Carbon Institute. Beyond Zero Emissions, they'd be in here as well, I think. Yeah.
I was going to say something like an art and culture non-profit, like climate arts.
Yeah, and there's some, and climate arts or something like that. That's an org that could fit across. A lot of these. This is not discrete categories here. A lot of organisations do all of these things. And that's where it's an ecology. What about in the protest and disruption space? What orgs are working there as professional orgs? There's one really obvious one.
Green.
Yeah. There's another one, like to cruise around in boats in the Southern Ocean. Sea Shepherd, yeah.
Do you think the knitting nanas are professional yet, or love the game?
Where would knitting nanas be on here? I mean, obviously they're in the participatory section, but which category?
Alternative models?
Yeah, possibly. They are in the protest and disruption camp, I think, in a unique way. Are they engaging with policymakers? Yeah, potentially. So a good way to think of this is what's an organisation's core tactic? Even if they are doing things across the spectrum here, what's their core tactic? And that's where you can fit them in. What about participatory groups who are doing lobbying?
That'd be something like getup.org.
Yeah. So you Get Up's an interesting one because obviously they've got professional staff, but they're also drawing on a participatory model to try and mobilise people. So they're doing both. It's a good example. What about the protest and disruption space?
Individual citizens going to marches, rallies.
Yeah. Stuff like the People's Climate March. Particularly in the lead up to Paris in 2015, there was a massive march in Melbourne. Some of you may have been involved. 60,000 people cruising down Swanston Street. That's a lot of people in the CBD. What about alternative models for either professional or participatory?
What about companies like Tesla that's moving towards green motor vehicles?
Yep, they'd count in there. Anyone been to Ceres Environment Park in Brunswick? Yep, that'd be in the professional alternative models. Participatory.
Could you kind of place any individual in that camp that decides to get a reusable coffee cup, or takes any action and uses that action as a way to show other people an alternative to what you could be doing?
Yeah, very much so. So this is where you as an individual actor can fit into this complex ecology of social movements. And then community groups, that kind of thing. So,
would you place the supermarkets in, say, the alternative model, a professional alternative model for removing the plastic bags?
Yeah, if you take a complex system view of environmental movements, although they're not environmental orgs, they're doing things in that space. So, I think you can put them in there. And they're also in that spaces because other actors are putting pressure on them to move. So that the companies, the supermarkets are not doing this because they want to. They're doing this because there's a market demand and a market pressure that's prompting them that it's in their business interest to make this move. And the social movement is important for making that case. All right, anything else to add to this before we move on? All right. Another key question, where are movement participants located and drawn from?
A lot of the time, like high income societies, where it's not as urgent to not be sustainable, if that makes sense. Like where you have the privilege to be sustainable.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So people who are just trying to survive don't have the time and space to do this kind of political action in some circumstances. So, often some environment movements in the West are criticised for being white, upper middle class, and not reflective of the broader experiences of people who are suffering environmental harms. And also criticised for not doing what's necessary in order to advance these movements. So they're actually very conservative in the politics that they advance as environmental actors. And I think there's something to that. Anything else that you'd add here? Yeah.
I think from the image you can kind of pull the transnational nature of where people are located now and how it is being I assume this is a German protest and it's regarding nuclear energy in Japan and the Fukushima disaster, I assume. So thinking that those ideas and those events that happened in a very far away place is having this effect on this protest there.
Yeah.
It shows the transnational nature of where these ideas and people are.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously the Fukushima disaster had a really big impact on debates around nuclear energy and how they were framed. Debates had been going on for a long time. And this disaster event put a lot of pressure and gave a lot of impetus to anti-nuclear protesters to be able to mobilise their case. So in the German case, this debate about nuclear energy was something that was happening anyway in terms of the transition of their energy system. There's a lot of decentralised renewable energy at the village and town level in Germany that's really exciting, where towns are essentially moving off central grids and deploying their own local level renewable energy stuff, building level or town wind farms, that kind of thing. So in that context, these people would be arguing that nuclear doesn't make sense for us anyway, and the Fukushima disaster demonstrates that this is not an industry that is desirable for Germany. But with information technology, it allows people making local protests to draw on support from elsewhere, which is a big change from this kind of movement operating 30 years ago wouldn't be able to draw on the same transnational support. So that's a really interesting point. This is a really important question too. Are there safe places for movement participants to organise, coordinate and campaign?
Depends on the state.
It does. It very much does. So if you are in China, what are your safe spaces at the moment as an environmental activist? Yeah, you want a VPN, that's for sure. There's quite a clear box in China. If you can mobilise your argument around their ecological civilization official doctrine of environmentalism, and say we're aligned with the state's objectives here, then there's a place for you to try and carve out a niche there. If you're anti-state in your message, then you're in the firing line. That's not a safe space for you to be. So this is all about the public sphere and what kind of space for political discourse there is here, Brad.
For the case of China, could you argue Hong Kong is that safe space?
Yeah, It's a safer space,
Yeah.
but it's not without its risks. If you look at in South America, there's a number of cases where environmental activists are killed, have been assassinated, extrajudicial killings, or hit squads employed by companies to bump off people. And that intersects not just with environmental actors, but with First Nations activists who are campaigning on environmental issues from that perspective. So, there's a lot of evidence that being an environmental activist can be a risk to your life in a lot of places around the world. Whereas if you're here in Australia, those risks are much, much smaller because there's more safe space in the public sphere to engage in this kind of discourse. The next variable is environmental movement participation. So who's in it? Why are they in it? How are they doing it? And part of this issue is identity. So is there a collective identity that would bring people together in an environmental movement?
I was going to say, like maybe going back to that elbow thing, when it's an issue of like nationalism, and then like, because you made that big point about the World Trade Center being flooded, which is like very specific to American culture. I think that did happen in mobilized a lot of people, because there was a sense of nationalism in the environmental movement.
Yeah.
So, yeah, when it is attributed to an identity that isn't necessarily environmentally like founded, it can be good.
Yeah.
I don't know what this is. That's why.
Does anyone know what this is? This is related to 350.org. It's an international climate change organisation. 350 related to 350 parts per million as what's been identified as the desired safe level of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere that would be necessary to avoid catastrophic global warming. Currently, we're just over 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. So this is specifically climate change related issue, but it depends on what the issue is, at what scale that issue is a thing. So is it a local issue, is it a national or international issue? And what kind of identity role, what kind of ideas you're putting out there to try and bring people to your movement, who are you trying to attract? And what's going to bring people together? The whole logic of social movements is based on the logic of numbers. The logic that as individuals, people don't have much political agency, but as individuals networked in a group, then you have greater leverage to be able to exert political influence. So having a core identity that can bring people together is really core to being able to activate that logic of numbers. All right, which people are available to participate in movement activities? And that gets back to the point we made just before. Who has the space in their lives to be able to engage in this kind of activity?
So say, I guess even if it's not participating in a broader movement, like the more like individual based movements, just like having like a key cup, or like not driving your car to work is dependent on you as well. Like even within like Australia, there's people that can't afford to be sustainable so much. Which kind of sucks.
Yeah. So this is hard. But if we take the argument that only upper middle class people have the space to be able to do this kind of stuff, how did other movements for social justice get off the ground? Yeah, Brad?
I think rather than being a socio-economic thing, it's more about a time thing. People who have time, and there's different categories of people in these classes that have that time. And whilst people have time, but it could also disenfranchise people who aren't working who have time as well. And I think that it's more about how much time you have to allocate to these things outside of the time you're using to actually live.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Time's a factor, but also clear existential need to organise is a thing. So to think of a different social movement, the campaigns around the labour movement going back to the 19th century, people working 16-hour days in industrial slums in completely unsafe conditions. How did we get to an 8-hour day with workplace safety laws and that kind of thing? So clearly those movements were able to mobilise and organise people who clearly didn't have the time, but there was an existential need for them to act collectively. So this is a complex question to disentangle. Who's available to participate in movements? And again, it depends on where you are, it depends on the issue. And again, thinking of mobilising ideas, what kind of emotional attachments keep people engaged in the movement? So it's one thing to recruit people into a movement, it's another thing to keep them participating in the movement, particularly when those political actions are going to create some hardships for the people involved. What keeps people engaged in the face of adversity? And this is where the emotional thing comes in. So what do you think? Any ideas or cases?
I guess like romanticizing the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to like a very transcendental philosophy of the environment.
Yeah.
It's like above humans.
Yep, very much so. Anything else? Yeah, Nico.
What if like someone's living by the beach, for example, and they see like all of these garbage, or like if you're living by the bay and then like you can see all of what's happening, or you're affected by climate change, then you'll be attached to it because like you live it every day.
Yeah, exactly. It's the love of the place, your attachment to where you live. Clearly, there's an emotional component to that, and I think most people would want to defend where they live from any kind of harm that would encroach on that. That's a good point. Any other ones?
Seeing loved ones possibly get sick, like with the fracking.
Yeah.
Of gas pollution. So having those around you immediately get sick, and that might drive you emotionally to help out.
Yeah. Or if there's a cancer cluster in a community around a particular industrial facility or something like that. Yeah, that's going to mobilise people to stay involved because there's clear personal impact. Yeah. It is hard to keep people mobilised around something abstract in the face of taking on adversity. So some kind of clear personal attachment to an issue, I think, is important here. What kind of motivations and incentives attract and keep people involved in environmental movements? So beyond the emotional aspects, why get involved? Why stay involved?
Perhaps to feel like a part of a bigger thing than just your daily grind.
Yeah. There's being involved in a collective, there's something affirming about that that brings you into contact with other people in a positive way.
I was going to say, it's quite like a really big thing to be involved in, like saving the planet.
Yeah.
And like it's a lot easier to justify staying with something that has so much need, not rather than a social issue, but like as opposed to a social issue that may or may not be like life-threatening.
Yep, that's a good point. And let's also rewind to all of those elements of sustainability transition that we looked at previously. So think of all of the changes and the innovations that need to take place there. There could be jobs involved in those transition processes. There could be positive elements in saying yes to something new rather than just saying no to something you don't want. So there's a lot of material incentives for being part of a sustainability transition process that'll get people on board. You could, if you're thinking of energy, reducing your power prices, something that's very topical in Australian politics at the moment. That might be a material incentive. Social networks. So how easy is it to just jump into a group where you don't know anyone? Yeah, most people don't like that. So any movement, new recruits are likely to come through the social networks of people who are already in the movement and draw people from that way. So social networks are an important aspect of how social movements function. That's pretty self-explanatory. Environment movement dynamics. So I'll have to race through the last few slides because I've got 5 minutes left. But what are the goals and scope of actors in the movement? And again, that depends on the scale and location of which the issue is placed. This is a graphic illustrating different scales at which environmental problems might manifest and at which actors might mobilise policy responses. If you think of a transnational issue like climate change, there are political actions that could be taken at each of these levels of scale to address those issues. And the most effective social movements will be able to mobilise different kinds of actions across different levels of scale in order to have the maximum political effect, from the self right up to the global community level. Environmental discourses, we talked about discourses before. What are the different ways of framing the environment and environmental issues? This graphic illustrates some of the different environmental discourses that exist. Where do you think Arnie Ness and deep ecology fit on this graphic?
Probably green consciousness.
Yeah, I'd say so. It's more on the radical end. Yeah.
I wouldn't put in survivalism because I don't feel like it's...
No.
He's more about looking after nature for the sake of nature rather than the sake of human survival, but also...
Yeah, and it's quite a radical message of connection in that versus survivalism, which is a radical individualism. Yeah, good point. You can see where sustainable development fits in there, and you can see where ecological modernisation is, which is quite related, and eco-modernism is very much about green technology and being able to mobilise the rollout of technology as the answer to environmental problems. So part of this ecology of environmental movements is this mosaic of different environmental discourses, interpreting how these responses should take shape. From that, you see the different strategies and tactics that environmental actors can draw upon in order to advance their political objectives. So this graphic is really interesting. Looks at the acts of omission, so things you're not doing or pulling out of, versus acts of commission where you're confronting power and building resistance. Have a good look at this graphic on the slides. I've already sent the slides to Commuter, so they should go on LMS at some point soon. But this is a really interesting graphic to flesh out the different kinds of strategies and tactics that social movement groups can draw upon. And the last point I want to touch on is the political consequences of environment movements. So we've looked at how they work. This point relates to what they have achieved and what they're likely to achieve. And if we think, I'd like you to go away with these questions. We don't have enough time to flesh these out now. But have a think about what difference environment movements have made, for whom and in what ways. Think about how environment movements might have played an important role in challenging authorities and in generating or halting social change, depending on the issue. And think about how environment movements cut across local, national and global levels. So this issue of scale and this issue of transnational networked interactions, which has grown over the internet era. So these are interesting questions to think about as we analyse the political impact of environment movements. And again, it depends on where you are and who you are, what your issue is and what you're reacting to in terms of the impacts. So final takeaway, think of the environment movements as a three-dimensional ecosystem of all kinds of different actors who broadly share the idea of wanting to preserve the environment, who are acting or coming from different spaces in the political economy of societies, who are coming from and acting at different scales, and whose power and influence is impacted by different intersecting variables of empowerment and disempowerment. And each of the actors within this three-dimensional ecology has a role in shaping how this broad, amorphous blob of environment movements acts and has political impacts across all scales. But the ultimate question is this. I want you to go away with this question. What's your relationship with the natural world? This is a very personal question. But again, as I said before, it's the question that's informing environmental politics and environment movements and the sustainability transition as we move forward. So thanks for coming today. I hope you found this presentation interesting. If you have any further questions or if you want some further information on some of the stuff we've looked at, please send me an email. I'll be happy to hook you up. So thanks a lot.